And thank you, Larry Suffredin, for being here, as you always are, for environmental concerns here in Cook County. So you've already paddled the North Branch of the Chicago River. You've already paddled the main channel of the Chicago River. Think of that, a famous river whose main channel is just 1.5 miles long. What an odd configuration, but that's the Chicago River. You've already experienced the attribute of the Chicago River that made it so strategic in terms of transportation. It's surrounded by very flat land, and in fact its proximity to the Mississippi River basin reaches a 6-mile distance. And as I explained to some of you earlier, that 6 miles was an easy portage, and in fact a lot of days, maybe even most days, it wasn't even a portage because it was marshy. And so the flatness, the proximity to the other river basin made this location a very strategic location. First the rivers, then the railroads that came around the south end of Lake Michigan and all had to make it around the south end to this very strategic location, and finally the airport. I mean, it's O'Hare every year is either the first or the second busiest airport because of the centrality of this location. So a few facts and figures about the river. In 1848, a canal was built, the Illinois and Michigan Canal, that actually joined the Chicago River to the Mississippi River basin, and that covered 96 miles away, not to the Des Plaines River, which would have been closer, but actually to the Illinois River where you're going. And Abraham Lincoln had a lot to do with that, public improvements. He was a member then of the Whig Party. The Whig Party was dedicated to public improvements. Then he moved on to the railroads and accomplished some of the same goals for Illinois by helping to create the railroads. Let me tell you something about famous days in the history of the Chicago River. I'll mention two that some of us who live here happened in the very recent past, which were sort of infamous, and both involve bridges. You've experienced our bridges already, and the history of Chicago River bridges has just been written up in a wonderful book from an author named Patrick McBriarty. And the Chicago River, because it was the combination of being relatively narrow and in a heavily populated area, but with river traffic going back and forth, inspired new construction models for rivers. So it's well equipped with bridges. I see a bridge right over there, and the feature that they almost all have is they move. But a couple of incidents happened in the last few years that were terrible. One was the Dave Matthews Band. They were in town. Their bus was going over one of the bridges on the north side. They chose that moment to dump from the bus stuff that you can only imagine that had gathered in the bus. And guess what? An architectural tour foundation was right under the bridge. And guess what happened to all the tourists who were there? Okay, that was one example of infamy. They denied it at first, and then they confessed. Second was really sad. The Kinsey Street Bridge that you traveled under today, right before Wolf Point, which is where the North and the South Branch came together. As they say, the bridges move. This is a bridge that moved up, and then there was a problem. The bridge tender didn't see what was happening. The bridge came down on a taxi cab. That was a terrible day. So those are two recent incidents. You went under, well, this morning when you started at North Avenue, you went under the most recent of all the bridges, because it was just finished the last couple of years, the North Avenue Bridge, which replaces a bridge that had been there a long time and just didn't have the right capacity. But it was built in the old style with the same kind of mechanical movement that had been created in Chicago in the first place. But let me give you some specific dates and some specific stories from the history of the Chicago River. Okay? November 3rd, 1863. November 3rd, 1863. The Rush Street Bridge, which was the first bridge across the main channel. It was just 3 blocks past where you turned around at Clark Street today, although it was an earlier version of the bridge. This was a cattle stampede. In those days, Chicago, even though it was a town, a thriving town, there was a lot of back and forth with farm animals. And what happened is a herd of cattle was being driven across the Rush Street Bridge. A ship was passing underneath. It rammed into the bridge. It made a lot of noise. The cattle stampeded. A lot of them wound up in the river. We're still talking about it. It was a very traumatic event. Cattle disaster on the main channel of the Chicago River. October 8th through October 10th, 1871. The Great Chicago Fire. It lasted over a period of 3 days, if you can imagine a city burning for over 3 days. It began actually very near here. It crossed the Chicago River South Branch to get to the downtown Chicago. And then later on it crossed the Chicago River main channel and it got to the north side. So there's in Chicago, there's the part north of the Chicago River, there's the part south, there's the part west, and it got to the south part and it got to the north part, didn't go to the west part. So that was a fire strong enough that it actually crossed the river at least twice. Obviously cinders were blowing, there were floating things in the water that were burning across the river twice. January 2nd, 1900. That was the day when the water from the Chicago River actually reversed into the sanitary and ship canal. This is this engineering marvel of which Larry Suffredin spoke that allowed the water, in essence, to drain the city of Chicago, which helped the health here, but affected our neighbors down there. And now, as we're hearing, we're worried about invasive species and so forth coming back into the Great Lakes. July 24, 1915. This was the tremendous disaster of the Eastland. The Eastland was in a port on the main branch of the Chicago River. The main branch in those days was the harbor, not the lake. It was actually the river. And it was a pleasure boat. And there was a company group from the telephone company that was out, and so many people were in the boat and then went to the wrong side of the boat, and the boat obviously was not meant for that many people, and it capsized, and the number of people who died was 814, which, by the way, is over twice as many as died in the Great Chicago Fire, which was 300 people. So 814 people died in one disaster. April 13, 1992, people the age of Mr. Schweik, Mr. Suffredin, Susan Johnson, and myself remember that day. That was the day of the Great Chicago Flood. And what happened then was that there was a breach in a pipe running underneath the north branch of the Chicago River. It's a pipe that, you know, people knew was there one way or another, but was ignored because it was connected with a system that had no current use. It was a whole series of tunnels that ran through the basement of lots and lots of the buildings in downtown Chicago. But the pipe was breached around Kinsey Street again. And what happened is 250 million gallons of water ran into that pipe and wound up in the basement of buildings all over downtown Chicago. So we had this infrastructure disaster in Chicago where the skyscrapers were bailing water out of their basements. The streets were flooded with water. There were pumps everywhere. The city was ground to a halt. And it was all over a forgotten system that connected all the buildings that had been built to make deliveries 100 years ago and deliver steam and goods and so forth. So those are some major events in the Chicago River, but there's one particular event that I have a very fond feeling for that occurred July 6, 1907, and I shared this picture with you the other day. That was the day when my great-grandfather brought his family, including my grandmother, my great-aunt, and other family members, and it was a Saturday, and they were out on the Saturday fishing in the Chicago River as a group, and we have a photograph of them fishing on the Chicago River at Foster Avenue as a group. And it's amazing because even a house painter on a Saturday fishing the Chicago River wore a tie. I don't understand that world, but that was the world that people lived in those days. And the Chicago River, for all intents and purposes, looks like a jungle. You don't see any habitation. You don't see any bridges at that point. It's just kind of in its natural state. And there was our family fishing. But now I have a new date. Let me see what it is. Okay, September 7th, 2014. So if you look at your phones, that's right, that's today. That's my new day for remembering the Chicago River. Because today's the day that the Wild River Academy came, committed to throwing a spotlight on our rivers, and our rivers in Illinois in particular. And this is much needed, not only for general reasons that we all need to know more about our rivers and learn what to do next, but because this famous river that got worldwide attention because it was reversed as an engineering miracle, now is a river whose future literally is unknown. It's an open question because now we're talking about re-reversing the river. So it's your group that's helping to lead the way and bringing attention. So this goes down in my list of great days on the Chicago River. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you.